It all started in Houston, a city that most people would consider ordinary. It had the usual hustle and bustle, the constant buzz of cars and the usual noise of everyday life. People walked down the streets, went to work, ran errands, and lived their lives, all as if everything was perfectly normal. But as I began to pay closer attention, there was an odd feeling lingering in the air. A sense that something was wrong, something unseen, yet undeniably present. At first, it wasn't clear. It wasn't like the city was suddenly on fire or the skies had turned blood red. It was subtle, just a creeping suspicion, a quiet whisper that started to grow louder as the days passed. It wasn't just another heat wave or a random power outage. Sure, the Texas heat was intense, but that was nothing new. It wasn't the type of weather that could bring about the kind of change I was sensing. It wasn't something as simple as that. The first signs were whispers, just rumors at first. People talking behind closed doors. Voices low, eyes shifting nervously. They mentioned strange happenings, the kind of things you'd usually dismiss as mere coincidence. Pets going missing, broken windows in homes with no sign of break-ins, cars parked in odd places, not even touched, as if the owners had simply vanished. But the weirdest part of all? No one ever seemed to talk about it for too long. It was as if they all knew better than to dwell on it, as if they didn't want to stir something they couldn't control. But I noticed the silence. I noticed the way people started glancing over their shoulders more often, the way they kept their voices hushed when they spoke of strange occurrences. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something was changing in the air. Something was shifting in the city. It was subtle, but it was there. The first time I really started to notice something off was with Mr. Johnson, my elderly neighbor. He was the type of man who always waved when I walked past his house. Every morning, without fail, he'd be standing in his front yard, watering his plants, or just sitting on the porch, enjoying his coffee. He had this friendly smile, and he always made sure to say hello, no matter how busy or tired he looked. It was a small thing, but I came to look forward to it. It was the kind of thing you take for granted when you live in a place where the days blend into one another. But then, one day, something was different. I walked past his house as usual, expecting the warm greeting. But there was nothing. No Mr. Johnson in the yard. No waving hand, no smile. His house was quiet. The blinds were drawn, and there were no lights on inside. I didn't understand. I didn't understand how someone could just vanish without a trace. No lights, no sign of struggle, just gone. It wasn't like Mr. Johnson to leave without telling anyone. He had no car, no way of getting far. His family lived in a different state, and as far as I knew, he had no plans to leave. The more I thought about it, the more it made no sense. And yet, as I looked around, it seemed like no one was making a fuss about it. There were no police cars, no search parties. It was as if people had simply accepted it and moved on. That's when the rumors started to spread. People whispered that maybe it was just the heat making people act strangely. That maybe Mr. Johnson had wandered off in the heat of the night, disoriented and confused. Others shrugged it off, saying it was just one of those things, a mystery that would eventually fade away. But deep down, I knew it was something more. Something wasn't right. The more I paid attention, the more I realized that there were other things happening around the city. A woman from a few streets over had reported hearing strange noises in her backyard, a rustling like someone was moving around. When she went outside to check, no one was there. Another neighbor, a man named Frank, found his dog dead in his yard one morning, with no signs of injury. No bite marks, no blood. It was as if the life had simply been drained from it. And still, no one seemed to ask questions. The oddities piled up, but everyone just shrugged it off as bad luck or coincidence. And there was the part that truly bothered me. The silence. People stopped talking to each other. Conversations became short, strained, as if everyone was afraid to say too much. The community that had once been so open, so friendly, started closing in on itself. It was as if we were all afraid to admit that something was wrong. And yet, in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something dark, something sinister, was creeping into our lives. One afternoon, I decided to take a walk and clear my head. As I passed Mr. Johnson's house again, I stopped in front of it, staring at the empty porch. I remembered how, just a few weeks ago, I had waved at him and smiled, and he'd waved right back. Now, it was just an empty house. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I stood there. I wasn't sure why, but I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. And that's when it hit me. I wasn't just worried about Mr. Johnson anymore. I wasn't just worried about the rumors. I was worried about myself. About all of us. Something was out there. And it wasn't just a bad batch of heat. It wasn't just a string of bad luck. Whatever was happening, whatever had taken Mr. Johnson and the others, was still here, hiding in the corners, waiting for the next person to disappear. I didn't know it then, but that was the moment everything began to change. It was the moment I realized that the life I knew, the life I thought was normal, was starting to unravel. And in its place, something far darker, far more terrifying, was beginning to take hold. The rumors were no longer just whispers. They were warnings, and the storm was coming. It happened so quickly that it almost seemed unreal. I was out running errands with my younger sister, Emma. We had just finished picking up groceries at the local store, a place we'd been to 1,000 times before without a second thought. It was a sunny afternoon, the kind that makes you feel like everything in the world is perfectly in place, and we were just chatting about what we'd have for dinner. I remember laughing at how we couldn't decide between pizza or pasta. Just another one of those silly decisions that didn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. We were walking towards the parking lot, the bags of food swinging from our arms, when we suddenly heard it, screaming. It wasn't the normal kind of noise, the kind you hear when kids are playing or when someone's goofing around. No, this was different. It was high-pitched, frantic, almost like someone was in intense pain. Emma and I froze, turning toward the sound, our eyes scanning the street. And there it was, coming down the sidewalk. At first, we thought it was some sort of prank. Maybe it was a guy in a costume, or someone who had taken Halloween a little too seriously. But as the figure stumbled closer, that's when we saw it for what it really was. It wasn't a person. It wasn't someone playing a joke. It was something else. Something we couldn't even begin to understand at the time. Its skin was almost the color of ash, pale and sickly, with patches of grayness scattered across its face and arms. Its eyes were empty, just dark holes where there should have been life. There was no emotion, no recognition, just an empty void staring back at us. The figure dragged its foot with every step, like it was fighting its own body just to move forward. But when it saw us, something changed. The slowness vanished, and it sprinted. It was so fast, my heart skipped a beat. I didn't have time to think. All I could do was react. I grabbed Emma's arm and pulled her with me toward the safety of the store. My breath was shallow, my pulse thumping in my ears. We ran back inside as quickly as we could, and just as the automatic doors slammed shut behind us, I heard the scream again, this time louder. But it wasn't just one person screaming. It was chaos. I turned, and I could see the people in the store, frozen in place, their eyes wide with fear. Some were clutching their carts, others... We didn't have a moment to waste. I grabbed Emma's wrist and dragged her toward the back of the store. "We need to get to the back room," I shouted, my voice desperate. But she was frozen in place, her eyes locked on the creature. "We need to go. Now," I shouted again, pulling her with me. We ran past the other shoppers, many of them still standing there, wide-eyed and motionless, not knowing what to do. Some of them started running too, but it was too late. The creature. No. The creatures? There were more now, spread through the store, attacking anyone in sight. It was like the world had turned upside down in an instant, and there was no safe place left. I could hear people yelling, crashing into things, knocking over cans and boxes. The whole store turned into a war zone. I heard screams, crashes, and the sickening sound of flesh being torn apart. Emma and I reached the storage room at the back of the store. I slammed the door shut, my heart racing, and we both collapsed against the wall, panting. The store was now silent, except for the distant sounds of chaos, screams, glass shattering, the thud of heavy footsteps. I tried to listen for anything familiar, but all I could hear was the low growl of something unnatural. It was the sound of something not quite alive, something that wasn't supposed to be. I pulled Emma closer to me, trying to calm her. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with shock. I didn't know what to say. What could I say? Everything had changed in a matter of minutes. "We're going to be okay," I said. But even I didn't believe it. There was no telling how long we'd have to wait. No telling if anyone would come for us, or if we would even survive this. All I knew was that the world had just become something unrecognizable, and there was no going back. The first attack, the first real sign that the horror we had been hearing about, the whispers that no one wanted to acknowledge, was here. And it was only the beginning. The days of normalcy were gone. The world had shifted, and now everything was a fight to survive. The zombies weren't just creatures from a storybook. They were real, and they were hunting us. We stayed in the storage room, holding on to whatever hope we could muster. The creatures outside weren't just wandering. They were hunting. They were smart. They were fast. And we knew, if we didn't act soon, we would be next. That was the first time I truly understood what it meant to be hunted, to be a prey in a world where the predators weren't just faster than you, they were relentless. The next few days were a blur. It all felt like I was walking through a fog that I couldn't shake off. The news outlets barely mentioned what was happening. They were still trying to keep it under control, downplaying the situation as if it were just another outbreak, another virus. They called it a pandemic, said it was just mass hysteria, that people were panicking over nothing. But deep down, I knew better. I'd seen it with my own eyes. The monsters outside weren't the result of some random virus or widespread panic. No, this was something far worse than anyone could have imagined. Each day that passed felt like another step into a nightmare I couldn't escape. I was glued to the news, hoping for some sort of explanation, something that made sense, but there was nothing. The government kept calling it a situation under control, reassuring the public that things would return to normal soon. But there was no normal left. The world I had known was slipping away, piece by piece, as the reality of the horrors outside grew clearer. It wasn't until I ran into Dr. Mitchell that I finally heard the truth. The part that sent chills down my spine and twisted my stomach into knots. Dr. Mitchell wasn't just some random acquaintance. He was an old friend of mine. We'd gone through medical school together, shared a lot of late nights in study groups, and had always stayed in touch, even after I'd left the field. When the outbreak first started, he had tried to get in touch, but the lines had been cut off. He was one of the few doctors who had stayed behind in the chaos, trying to make sense of everything. I had always trusted him, and when I finally reached him, I wasn't prepared for what he told me. "They're still alive," he said. His voice sounded shaky, unlike anything I'd ever heard from him before. It was as if he was speaking from a place of deep fear, and I could hear the disbelief in his tone. He had never been one to get emotional, especially not in situations like this. But what he said next was a revelation that hit me harder than any of the attacks I had witnessed. "They're still conscious," he continued. "The virus, whatever it is, isn't just turning people into zombies. It's keeping them alive. Their bodies may be decaying, but their minds, their thoughts, they're still there. They're still aware. I was silent for a long moment, unable to process what he was saying. It didn't make sense. Zombies weren't supposed to be aware. They were supposed to be mindless, just flesh-hungry creatures wandering around, only driven by instinct, what the movies had always told me. That's what I had believed. But Dr. Mitchell's words shattered that illusion.
Wait, I finally said, my voice trembling. You're saying they're still thinking? They're still aware of what they're doing? He sighed, a long, heavy exhale that seemed to carry the weight of everything he had learned over the past few days. Yes, but not in the way you think. They're still conscious, but it's like their minds are trapped inside their bodies, forced to watch as their bodies are controlled by something else, something we can't explain. It's like they're prisoners in their own skin, unable to do anything but obey. I felt a chill run through me. The idea that these creatures, these zombies, weren't just soulless monsters, but living beings trapped in a nightmare of their own was something I hadn't even considered. It was worse than I had imagined. They weren't just victims of a virus. They were victims of something far darker, something that kept them alive, but tortured them in the process.
We don't know how it started, Dr. Mitchell continued. It could have been a mutation, a viral outbreak, or something else entirely. But one thing is clear. It's not just about killing the body anymore. It's about controlling it. I was speechless. I had been prepared for the idea of a zombie outbreak. Hell, we had all seen the movies, read the books, and played the games. But this was something completely different. The idea that these things, these walking corpses, were still alive in some way, still aware, was beyond anything I could comprehend. It wasn't just a mindless apocalypse we were facing. It was a nightmare where the dead weren't truly dead, and the living had to fight against a force they couldn't even see.
I've seen it, Dr. Mitchell said, his voice heavy with the weight of his experiences. I've seen them look at people. Their eyes locked on them like they recognize them. But then they attack. They move with purpose, like they're being controlled. It's not random. It's not like they're hungry for flesh. It's like they're being forced to do it. And that's what scares me the most. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. The idea that these creatures were still being controlled by some external force, something we couldn't understand, was terrifying. It wasn't just a virus anymore. It was an invasion of the mind. And we had no idea how to fight it. Is there a way to stop them? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I already knew the answer, but I had to ask anyway. I don't know, Dr. Mitchell admitted. We're still trying to figure that out. We've been running tests, trying to find a way to reverse whatever's happening, but so far, nothing works. They're too far gone. Whatever's controlling them is too powerful. I sat there in stunned silence, trying to process everything. The world had already been turned upside down, and now it felt like it was falling apart even more. These weren't just mindless monsters. they were something worse. They were still alive in some way, still trapped in their own bodies, forced to do things they couldn't control. They were prisoners of their own flesh. A thought haunted me as I hung up the phone, the weight of Dr. Mitchell's words settling in. It was clear now. This wasn't just a virus, and it wasn't just a random outbreak. Something far more sinister was at work, and no one knew how to stop it. People were still fighting for their lives, running through the streets, trying to escape the chaos that had overtaken the city. But the real horror wasn't just the walking dead outside. It was the truth that, from whence it happened, no matter how fast they ran, no matter how far they went, there was nowhere safe anymore, because the dead were still alive, and they were still coming. It didn't take long for the city to fall apart. What started as a whisper of a problem, a small, almost imperceptible ripple in the fabric of daily life, quickly erupted into chaos. The streets that had once been filled with the hum of everyday activity were now empty, save for the wreckage and the distant, eerie sounds of something far worse lurking in the shadows. The city that once seemed so alive was now slowly turning into a shell of its former self, the air heavy with the stench of fear and decay. The first few days, there was still a semblance of normalcy. People were still trying to hold on to routines, even as the news trickled in about the strange attacks. But as the panic grew, the city's pulse began to slow, and people started to scatter. The highways, once bustling with commuters, were now filled with cars stuck in traffic, their engines idling, honking in frustration. No one could get anywhere. The roads were jam-packed, the exits blocked, and it didn't take long for the sense of urgency to settle in. People tried to flee, but the city had become a trap. I remember standing in the middle of it all, watching cars abandoned in the middle of intersections, doors hanging wide open, the drivers nowhere to be found. Some people had tried to make a run for it on foot, but most of them were gone now, swallowed up by the chaos. The air was thick with the smoke of fires burning in the distance, but there was no one left to put them out. The sirens, once a comforting sound signaling help, had turned into a distant wail, a constant reminder that no one was coming to save us. And the zombies? They were everywhere. At first, it was just a few of them. You could avoid them if you stayed inside, stayed in the shadows. But soon, they multiplied. What had started as a handful of slow-moving, mindless creatures quickly grew into a terrifying swarm. It didn't take long for them to spread across every neighborhood, turning the city streets into a maze of danger and death. You couldn't walk 2 blocks without hearing the guttural growl of one stumbling out of an alley, or the scraping sound of its feet dragging across the pavement. They were everywhere,
lurking in the corners, hiding in the buildings, waiting for the next person to wander too close. They weren't like the slow zombies you see in the movies either. No, these things were different. At first, I thought the same thing that everyone else did. I thought they'd shuffle around in a daze, easy enough to avoid. But these creatures were fast. So fast that it made your heart race just watching them. They'd sprint after you if they caught sight of you, moving with a ferocity I never thought possible for something that should have been dead. Their eyes, those black, empty eyes, were fixed on their prey, their movements relentless and purposeful. It wasn't a random shuffle or a slow drag anymore. These things were hunting us.
And they weren't just fast, they were cunning too. They adapted. They learned. It was as if they were evolving in real time. They figured out how to blend into the background, how to hide in plain sight. They weren't just mindlessly wandering the streets anymore. They were waiting. They were watching. They knew how to track us, how to set traps. A scream here, a door left ajar there. It was enough to draw them in. The people who hadn't yet been caught, they became prey, just like the rest of us. One night, I went out with a small group to check on some of the neighbors who hadn't made it out of the building. It was getting harder to even step outside during the day. Too many of them were out. Too many of them were wandering the streets in broad daylight. But we had no choice. People had gone silent, retreating into their homes, and the air had grown thick with fear. But even then, the threat was always there. We moved carefully, listening for the faintest sound of footsteps or the scrabble of nails across concrete. The streets were eerily quiet, except for the occasional shuffle, the distant scream. And then we heard it, an eerie, low growl coming from an alleyway just ahead. I froze, my heart skipping a beat as the noise got closer. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I glanced around the corner. At first I didn't see anything, but then, out of nowhere, it appeared. One of them. It was a woman. Or at least, she had been once. Her skin was deathly pale, almost gray, with streaks of black veins running across her face. Her eyes were wide open, but there was nothing behind them. Just emptiness. She moved fast, her body jerking unnaturally, as she rushed toward us with a speed I could barely comprehend. She let out a low hiss. I barely had time to react. One of the others, a guy named Thomas, shoved me out of the way and took the brunt of the hit. He fell backward, crashing into a pile of trash cans with a sickening thud. The creature was on top of him in an instant, biting into his neck, its teeth sinking into his flesh with horrifying precision. Panic set in. I screamed for help, but the others were already running, abandoning him without a second thought. I ran with them, my legs feeling like lead, my heart pounding in my chest. But as I turned the corner, I saw them, more of them, dozens of them, all gathering in the streets, all heading in our direction. They were too fast, too smart. There was no escaping them. The worst part was realizing that it wasn't about food anymore. It wasn't about hunger. They didn't need to eat. They didn't need anything. It was about the hunt. They were hunting us, and we were the prey. There was no escape, no safe place. Every corner, every alley, every street was crawling with them. And they weren't just trying to feed. They were after something else. They were after us. We made it back to the building, but the terror was far from over. Every night felt like a countdown, a race against time. The dead were relentless, and the world we once knew was slipping away. There were no more rules, no more safety. We were all just running, trying to survive, hoping we could find a way out. But every time we thought we were safe, the zombies found us. The worst part was the realization that we weren't just facing a plague of the dead. We were facing something far worse. Something alive. Something that was hunting us. And it wasn't going to stop until there was nothing left. Surviving became an endless game of hide and seek. The world we had known was gone, swallowed up by the chaos and the madness that had descended upon the streets. It wasn't about finding food or shelter anymore. It was about survival, plain and simple. Every day was a struggle, a fight against the dead, and in some ways, against ourselves. We scavenged for whatever we could find, searching through abandoned stores, homes, and buildings, hoping to stumble upon something useful. But every time we thought we'd found a safe place, it wasn't long before it turned into another battleground. The only thing that seemed to remain constant was the gnawing sense of fear that followed us everywhere. My group had managed to find a place to settle for a while, an old warehouse on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't much, but it had enough food and supplies to last us for a while. There was no electricity, no running water, but it was safe. At least we thought it was. We set up camp inside, fortified the entrances, and did what we could to make ourselves as comfortable as possible. We took turns keeping watch, knowing that one slip-up could cost us everything. But even here, we weren't safe. The sound of the undead moving outside at night was enough to remind us of that. Sometimes it was just one or two of them, wandering aimlessly down the street, their footsteps echoing in the stillness of the night. Other times, it sounded like the entire block was crawling with them, shuffling, growling, moaning, their relentless pursuit never ending. We would huddle together in the dark, trying to keep quiet, trying to stay as hidden as possible. It felt like every creak of the building, every breath we took, could give us away. There were nights we didn't sleep at all. We'd just lie there, our eyes wide open, listening to the sounds outside. The moans and growls of the zombies seemed to be everywhere, a constant reminder that we weren't safe, that the world we once knew was gone forever. Sometimes I would hear the familiar rustling,
of footsteps in the hallways or on the roof. Sometimes I'd hear a faint scrape against the metal, like a fingernail dragging across a surface, and it would send a shiver down my spine. We couldn't tell if it was one of them, just lurking outside, or if it was something more. We couldn't afford to make any noise. If we did, we knew we'd be giving ourselves away.
In those moments, I began to wonder if we were ever going to get out of this. The world outside was a wasteland, crawling with the undead. The cities were lost, overrun by creatures that weren't even human anymore. And the worst part, there didn't seem to be any end in sight. Every day felt like we were living on borrowed time, waiting for the next attack, the next danger to come crashing through our door. I began to wonder if we'd ever find a way out. Was there even a way out, or was this just our new reality, a nightmare we couldn't wake up from? We tried to fight back, of course. We couldn't just hide forever. But every time we tried to defend ourselves, it felt like we were fighting a losing battle. We gathered whatever weapons we could find. Pipes, bats, anything we could use as a makeshift weapon. But no matter how hard we hit, no matter how many times we tried to fight them off, the zombies kept coming. Their bodies were broken, their skin rotting away, but they just kept moving. They didn't feel pain. They didn't get tired. They didn't stop. And neither did we. We couldn't afford to stop. Every time we thought we'd taken down one of them, two more would appear, coming from the darkness like shadows in the night. It became clear that weapons barely made a dent. We had no way of knowing how many of them were out there, how many of them were still lurking, waiting for us to make a mistake. The worst part was that we weren't sure if there was any way to stop them at all. There was no cure, no vaccine, nothing that could save us. The virus, whatever it was, had already taken hold, and it was spreading faster than we could keep up. The world outside was collapsing, and all we could do was hold on, do our best to survive another day. But as the days turned into weeks, something else started to change. It wasn't just the world around us that was falling apart. We were starting to change, too. The virus that had infected the dead seemed to be affecting us as well, in ways we couldn't understand. At first, it was subtle. Just little things, little changes in our behavior. We'd snap at each other over small things, tensions running high in the close quarters. But it wasn't just stress. It was something more. It was as if the virus was starting to take hold of us, too. We started feeling different. My friend Dan was the first one to show real signs of it. At first, it was just small things. He'd get quiet, distant, staring off into space for long periods. But then, it started to get worse. He'd look at people in a way that made them uncomfortable, like he was sizing them up, like he was waiting for something. It wasn't the way he used to look at people.
It wasn't normal. It wasn't just curiosity or concern. It was something else. It was like he was hungry. Like he was trying to decide who would be the easiest to attack.
One night, I caught him staring at Emma, my sister, his eyes cold and calculating. It was the first time I'd really felt the fear creeping up on me. The look in his eyes, it wasn't him. It wasn't the Dan I had known. It was something else. Something twisted. I called out to him, snapping him out of it. But the moment I did, he shook his head, as if he was waking up from a trance. He looked at me confused, as if he didn't understand why he was staring at her like that. But I saw it in his eyes, the hunger, the confusion, the darkness, and I knew something had changed. No one knew what to do. We didn't want to kill him. He was our friend. But how long could we keep him around before he became a danger to the rest of us? How long could we keep pretending that he was still human when everything inside of us told us otherwise? None of us had the answers. We just kept surviving one day at a time, trying to hold on to whatever shred of hope we could find. But with every passing day, the line between what was human and what was not grew blurrier. We weren't sure if we were becoming like them, or if they were just becoming like us. It didn't matter. The only thing that did was surviving, and we weren't sure how long we could keep doing that. The world outside was falling apart. The zombies were everywhere. But inside, we had our own battle to fight. And the worst part was, we weren't sure who the real enemy was anymore. It wasn't until we found that old research facility near the outskirts of Houston that the full picture started to come into focus. We had been searching for answers for so long, hoping to understand what had happened, why everything had fallen apart so quickly. We had been holed up in our makeshift shelter for days, weeks, maybe even longer, hiding from the growing army of the undead that seemed to be multiplying by the hour. We had to know what had caused this, what had turned our city, our world into a nightmare. The place we found was abandoned. Or at least it seemed to be. It was an old research facility, tucked away far enough from the heart of the city that no one had bothered to check it. We had stumbled upon it while we were out scavenging, looking for any supplies we could find to keep us alive for another few days. It was a building that at first glance seemed like just another ruin, another relic of a world that had long since passed. But as we approached, something about it felt different. It wasn't like the other places we had seen. The air around it felt charged, like it was holding something in, something dangerous. We had no choice but to explore. We needed answers, and if this place could offer us even the smallest clue, we had to take the risk. Our supplies were running low, and we couldn't keep hiding forever. We broke in quietly,
careful not to make any noise. The building was dark, the air thick with dust and decay. But as we moved deeper into the facility, we found something that sent a chill through my bones. The walls were lined with old research papers, data logs, and photographs. Some of them were yellowed with age, others were newer. But all of them were covered in strange symbols and codes we didn't understand. There were names, dates, and phrases that kept repeating. Reanimation, vital signs, cell regeneration. But it wasn't until we reached a back room, the one that was locked and sealed off from the rest of the facility, that the truth finally came to light.
The room was filled with computers, monitors, and strange equipment I'd never seen before. There was a large table in the center of the room, covered with a thin layer of dust. But it was clear this room hadn't been abandoned for long. On the table were files and documents, all containing one horrifying truth. The government had been working on something far worse than anyone could have imagined. It wasn't a biological weapon, an accident, or some virus gone wrong. No, this was far darker. This was no ordinary experiment. The documents detailed a secret project, one that had been running under the radar for years. A project to reanimate the dead. At first, they had thought they could bring back people who had died from illness or old age, helping people recover from fatal diseases, reversing the effects of time. They believed they could give people a second chance at life. As we went through the documents, piecing together the terrifying details, we realized they hadn't just brought the dead back to life. They had done something else. Something worse. The research had evolved, spiraling into something unthinkable. They didn't just bring the dead back. They gave them power. They had injected them with experimental serum, altered their biology, enhanced their strength, speed, and cognitive functions in ways that should have been impossible. They had created something beyond human understanding. Creatures that were stronger, faster, and somehow still aware of who they were. That's when it hit me. The zombies we had been running from, the ones that seemed so different from what we had seen in movies or heard about in stories. They weren't just mindless creatures driven by hunger. They were still alive in some sense, still capable of thought, still able to remember who they were, who they had been. They were prisoners in their own bodies, forced to obey the commands of whatever had taken control of them. The mindless, hungry zombies we had first encountered, they were just the beginning. The true horror of what was happening to the world wasn't just the Walking Dead. It was the fact that they had never truly died. The most terrifying part of all was understanding why they didn't want to eat. It wasn't about hunger. It wasn't about feeding on the living. No, it was about control. The serum that had been injected into them had done more than just bring them back from the dead. It had given them an insatiable desire to dominate, to control, to enslave the living. They didn't need to feed to survive.
They were after something much worse.
They were after us.
They were hunting us,
Not for food.
but for power.
Reports spoke of experiments gone wrong, of people losing their minds as the serum took over, of soldiers who had once been proud and noble, now reduced to something terrifying, something uncontrollable. The worst part was that the more they injected, the stronger they became. The more their bodies evolved, the harder it was to stop them. And the longer the virus stayed active, the worse the consequences became. It was as if they were slowly becoming a new breed of creature, something that couldn't be killed, something that couldn't be reasoned with, something that would never stop coming. We were living in a nightmare. This wasn't just about surviving a zombie outbreak. It wasn't just about staying hidden long enough to make it through another day. Now, it was about stopping something much worse. The creatures outside weren't just zombies anymore. They were still alive, in a twisted, horrific way. As we sifted through the papers, one last report caught my eye. A message from someone who had been working on the project before it all fell apart. The final note, dated just days before the outbreak began, was chilling in its simplicity. We've made a mistake. The serum is too powerful. They're awake, and they're coming for us. It's too late to stop them. The truth had been right in front of us the entire time, hidden in plain sight. The government had created these monsters, and now we were all paying the price for their hubris. There was no going back. There was no cure. There was only survival, and we were running out of time. The zombies, the creatures, the walking dead, they weren't just a random outbreak. They were the consequence of an experiment gone horribly wrong. And now, we were all caught in the middle of it. We had thought we were just fighting to survive the undead. But the real enemy wasn't just the monsters outside. The real enemy was the dark truth we had uncovered. The truth that told us that the dead weren't dead at all. They were still alive, and they would never stop coming for us. And as I stared at the final reports, the weight of it all sank in. The world as we knew it was gone, and it wasn't just the dead we had to worry about. It was the ones who had never really died in the first place, the ones who had been brought back, but at a cost too terrible to comprehend. And they weren't done yet.